Hello, my name is Lee Taylor, and I really like to knit, so much so that some of my friends call me the Knitwit. I hope you enjoyed today's video and possibly even learned something. So let's get started. Hello and welcome to Knit Bits number 18. We have a Swatch Lab to do this week. We're going to look at some finished objects, and we're going to be discussing some knitting terminology that may be a bit confusing to new knitters or even long-time knitters who may not use these. So let's go ahead and jump over and get started. First up, as always, we are going to start with a Swatch Lab. We are doing 3 swatches together, or at least the end of it, because today we're going to be talking about how to bind off. So once you've got done knitting your project, how do you finish it? We're going to go over the 3 most common. We're going to be doing the regular bind off, we're going to be doing a stretchy bind off, and then we're going to be binding off in pattern. So let's switch to the overhead and take a look on how to do these techniques. In today's Swatch Lab, we are going to be binding off 3 different ways. We are going, let me zoom out here just a smidge. Sorry about that. Binding off 3 different ways. Yes, I will confess, I went and bought yarn and needles just for Swatch Labs, and no, I feel no guilt or remorse for doing it because I don't need an excuse to buy more stuff, but I do it anyway. So first off, before I get carried away here, we're going to be binding off on 3 separate swatches. We're going to be binding off regular, doing a stretchy bind off, and then binding off in pattern. So without further ado, let's jump over and bind off regular. So in binding off regular, I just knit a simple swatch here with 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 stitches wide, and I knit for 10 ridges because you don't need a huge swatch to show how to bind off. Now again, this is going to be the standard bind off. This is the main bind off. This is the first one that most people learn because it is the simplest. It is not my favorite, but I do use this one from time to time. So on Swatch Lab, I'm going to be working from the outside of my cake, so when I get done, I can frog this, more on that at the end of the video, and I can re-wrap it up rather than working from the inside and having to rewind it every time. So I'm going to sit this down so that way I will be able to knit from it. And I am going to take the stitches off of the stitch holder and put them on our swatching circular needles here. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to lower the camera down just a bit here. Now I like using the circular needles because these are very short, so it's very easy for me to knit with the camera right above me. It's less chance of me bumping and hitting it as it would be with a longer needle, but I can still show what I'm doing. So that little flurry, what I do is I grab the yarn like this, flip my hand around, and then use my pinky and twist my hand around and use my pinky and grab that yarn like that. That is how I tension my yarn, like that. Ring not necessary. Okay, so we are going to be binding off. You can do this purlwise or knitwise. I am doing it knitwise, and you can see purlwise when we bind off in pattern. So to bind off, we're going to knit 2 stitches, just like normal. So whatever the way you knit, whether it's continental, English, however, you're going to knit 2 stitches. Then what you're going to do is you're going to take the point of this needle here and you're going to insert it into this first stitch like this, okay? Let me do that one more. Insert into the first stitch, okay? Then what you're going to do is you're going to, I put my thumb on here just by instinct, you're going to take this stitch and pull it up and over this second stitch. So let me get up close here. Up and over. There's our second stitch. Up and over that second stitch. And then you slide your needle out. Okay? That's what it's going to look like. So now we've bound off one stitch. So now we're going to knit our next stitch here. And once more, take this stitch here, which now is called the first stitch, and this is the second. Grab our first stitch. Again, I put my thumb over this, and I usually hold this like this. Okay? Up and over that second stitch. Okay? You want to kind of, I take my knitting needle and I kind of roll it, and that pulls out a little bit of slack. Okay? This regular bind-off is not very stretchy, and if you find that your bind-off is too tight, you can use a larger needle for your right-hand needle, 1 or even 2 sizes bigger. Or when you go to bind off, which I will show you once more right here, when you go to bind off, they say bind off loosely. I don't like that term, because you can knit or bind off loosely for a couple of stitches, and then for whatever reason you just slowly become more and more tight as you work along, especially if you are already a tight knitter. So what I recommend, instead of saying bind off loosely, is bind off and then take this needle right here while the other stitch is still on there and give it a good tug. Okay? See how big I'm making that stitch? Of course, you don't necessarily want to make it that loose, but you just want to pull a bit of extra slack out, and that will help bind off where it's not so tight. And you're just going to do that all the way across. You're just going to have 2 stitches on your right needle, pick up that first stitch, and pop it up and over the second. And again, I give my needle a little twist, and then you knit another stitch, because you have to have 2 stitches. Okay. And then you slip this up and over. And again, you're doing that all the way across. My cable's getting a little twisted here. There we go. You're going to do that all the way across, knitting a stitch and binding off, pulling that up and over that other stitch. And you're just going to do that again all the way across the stitches. Again, I cast on 12 stitches, and you're just going to bind off across. I use this particular bind off when I'm doing the like the bind off on the thumb or fingers of a fingerless mitt. If I don't want it to be very stretchy, if I want it to hold secure, then I use this bind off. This is a good general purpose bind off. Especially if you can master it not being super tight, so that way it puckers. So if you go up a couple of needle sizes or pull out some extra slack. But you know what? If you're knitting something and you want it to pucker, then go ahead. By all means, pull this tight as you can get it and make it pucker for you. That's not what I'm going for in this, so that's not what I'm going to do. Again, I just give my needle a slight roll, a slight twist, and that pulls out just a little bit extra. So you've now got 2 stitches left here. Center in the screen a little better. And you're just going to do it the exact same. Knit and pull that up and over, just like that. Now you've only got 1 stitch, so what do? Well, there's a couple of options here. You can, first off, you would need to cut this, because you don't need this yarn anymore. I am not cutting it, so that way I can reuse it. But I can still show you what to do here. So your first option is to cut this yarn right here. Say you cut it right here. Then you just take and pull that yarn right out through that stitch. So then you only have the 1 there. You know what? I'm going to go ahead and snip it. I don't have any scissors here, so I'm going to use a knife, so bear with me on that. So let's say you cut your yarn. Okay, your first option would be to just pull that yarn right through, okay, and then weave that in. I don't like doing that. I don't feel like it gives me the right finished look, and so I don't want to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that bind-off out. See here, I know I just put it back on the same stitches, so I'm going to take that bind-off out and bind off again, like so. Whoops. What happened here? Oh, I need to reknit this first, or the second stitch. Okay, so we're going to knit it. Now we can bind off. Okay, so again, what you can do is you can take that and pull it all the way through. But again, I don't like doing that. Let me move that out of the way. I like to take the tail end and I like to put it through that loop instead. And then I pull it snug. And I feel like that gives a much neater, it does add an extra stitch, but when you go to pull that in and weave in your end, that pulls that extra stitch down, and it lays better for me. The traditional way is when you're done, you just pull it through those two loops, and then you're done, and then you weave in your ends. So personal preference. So this, I want to show, this is the long tail cast on here, and this is the standard bind off. So the long tail cast on has a good bit of stretch here, and your standard bind off doesn't have the same, okay? It does have a little bit because, you know, we pulled each stitch a little larger as we worked them. But then as you can see, it has this nice, you have these nice V's that's laying on top. Sometimes they're kind of tilted forwards, especially on stockinette. And then this backside back here looks like this. So that is the standard bind off. Next up, we are going to be doing a stretchy bind off using this yarn. And I've already taken it off of the stitch holder, and we are now ready to work. So to do a stretchy bind off, it's very simple. First off, you've got to knit 2 stitches, just like your regular bind off. So we're going to bind off, or I'm sorry, we're going to knit 2 stitches here. 1 and 2. Now what we're going to do is, instead of flipping this up and over, we're going to, and you've seen I kind of pulled this down a bit, we're going to insert this needle through both stitches, okay? Just like that, okay? It doesn't have to go all the way on, you just have to get your point all the way through it. Then you're going to wrap the yarn around your needle, and you're going to pull that through both stitches, okay? That is called knitting 2 together through the back loop. So we've got 1 stitch here. Again, get to the center of the screen, that would help. 1 stitch here. Now we need to knit another stitch here, because you need 2 stitches to do this. Okay. Now insert the point of this needle. Again, you know, pull that down, that helps. Get that needle through both stitches here. Let me do this up here. Through both stitches. Okay, I put my thumb there just to hold and secure that. Then they can't slide off. Wrap the yarn around the needle and knit those 2 together through the back loop. Just like so. And I take and twist my needle, twirl it, and that pulls out a little extra slack, so it's not super snug, okay? And you're just going to repeat that all the way across the stitches, okay? So you knit a stitch, And then we're going to knit 2 together through the back loop. And the reason I say back loop is when you go to do this like this right here, you're not coming through these front legs of the stitch. You're coming through back behind it. That means those are the back loops. Okay? And knit those together. Again, I twist my needle a bit. That pulls out some slack. You can also just pull your needle towards you. But just pull out a little bit of extra slack if you find your binding off a little too snug for your tastes. Knit another stitch. Insert the point of your left needle through the 2 stitches on your right needle. I place my thumb on those 2 stitches on the left needle. That way that holds snug. Wrap the yarn around. You see, I use my fingers to push my needles. And knit those together through the back loop. Pull that out so it's not so snug. And we're just going to work that way all the way across. This is the bind-off that I use most often, but that is because my standard bind-off usually is too snug. So I use this, and that adds a little bit of extra stretch, and then it doesn't pucker as much. But because you are knitting that together like that, or you're knitting your stitch, and instead of slipping that up and over, you're knitting those again, it does use more yarn than your standard bind-off. So that's something you need to consider. If you're running low on yarn, then you might want to do the standard bind-off and use larger needles or pull out a little bit of slack rather than knit, because you're basically knitting an extra row by doing it this way. Okay? Because you're knitting each stitch twice. Because that was the first knit. Then when you go to bind off, that is the second knit. Okay? So just something to consider. It's not a bad thing. It's not a good thing. It's just a thing. Just a bit of info to have in your knowledge bank. Again, I twist or just pull, but I find twisting works a little better for me. It's less, because sometimes when I pull, I end up pulling way too far. You can take this and kind of pull it down to snug that up if you need to. If you find your bind-off is too loose, that is one way of doing it, is taking and just pulling out some extra slack. Okay. Work a little slack here. Knit. Knit 2 together through the back loop. Again, this makes a stretchy bind-off. Some call this a very stretchy bind-off. I just call it a stretchy bind-off. Because there's sometimes where multiple people come up with the same idea and they don't realize that someone else has done it, so they name it something that they would know. And then you have multiple names for the exact same technique. The age of the internet has helped limit that somewhat, but that still happens. Okay, we have now bound off. We've got 1 stitch left, so we will take our yarn and cut it. Normally you would use scissors. I didn't have any close to hand. And you would pull this. You would either pull out your tail completely or do like what I do and take the end of your tail through that loop. And I don't just take it through whatever. I kind of hold this and see, because this way it's going to kind of twist, and I don't want to do that. I want to just send it straight through. Pull that, and I pinch right here because I know that that tension is what I want. So I pinch there so that way when I pull this, it can't tighten that any further. Okay? So that is the stretchy bind-off. So as compared to this bind-off, where this is the cast-on, this is the bind-off, both were used the long tail cast-on. So there's the stretch of the cast-on, and there's the stretch. So the cast-on has quite a bit more stretch than this one does. Now the stretchy bind-off, here we have the long tail cast-on, okay, a good bit of stretch. Here we have the stretchy bind-off. See how much more stretch that has than that one? You may hear Mama Kitty in the background. She's being very vocal today. So that one stretches there, this one stretches clear out to here. So this one is stretchier than this one, thus the name Stretchy Bind-Off. Standard Bind-Off. And that is how to do the Stretchy Bind-Off, and it being compared to the Standard Bind-Off. For this final bind-off, we are going to be binding off in pattern. Okay? So that means we're going to be binding off pearls with a pearl bind-off. We're going to be binding off the knit with a knit bind-off. But don't worry, they're worked the exact same as a regular stitch. We are going to be using this yarn to do this. Hopefully that shows up well against the background. So we're going to start this. These are presenting as a purl stitch, which means there are a purl bump right beneath these two stitches. These are knit stitches. You can tell because there is no purl bump or purl collar. It is a V directly below. So these are purls. We're going to bind off with the purl stitch. So as usual, we bind off with the purl. Yarn is in front. We enter this front leg from right to the left. I'm holding my thumb on the needle. And then we're just going to purl that stitch. Okay? This next stitch is a purl. So we're going to purl that stitch. Like so. Now we're going to move the yarn to the back to get it out of the way. Okay? So we've got two stitches here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to put our needle into this first stitch and flip it up and over, just like the standard bind-off. Okay? Now our yarn's in back, and we can take a look and see what our next stitch is. Our next stitch is a knit stitch, so the yarn needs to stay in the back, and we are going to knit this next stitch. Like so. Okay? Now we're going to come and grab this first stitch, up and over that second stitch. We have now bound off two purl stitches. Now then, this next stitch is a knit stitch, so the yarn stays in the back and we knit that stitch. Okay? And then we bind that off. We just flip this first stitch up and over. Okay? Now we've got a purl stitch to bind off. So we bring the yarn to the front, just like we would with any purl, and we're going to purl that stitch. Okay? Purl that stitch. Now I move the yarn to the back to get it out of my way. We now grab this up and over, just like that. Our next stitch is a purl, so the yarn needs to come back to the front, and we're going to purl that. Take the yarn to the back to get it out of the way and bind off, up and over. Okay, next stitch is a knit, so our yarn can stay in the back. We're going to knit that stitch and then bind off. Pick that up, and over. Our next stitch is a knit, knit it, pick this up and over. Our next stitch is a purl, and if you're confused on what I mean when I said the next stitch is a purl, I will put a link to the video down below where I did 1x1 ribbing, 2x2 ribbing, and seed stitch, and show you how to read if a stitch is a knit stitch or a purl stitch. Okay? This next one is a purl, so we need to bring the yarn to the front like we would with any purl, and we need to purl that stitch. Okay, I take the yarn to the back to keep it out of my way, and then now I just need to take this up and over. Okay, next stitch is a purl, so bring this back to the front, purl this stitch, take the yarn back out of my way, up and over. Next stitch is a knit, so we're going to knit it, bind off, up and over. Apologize for that. I had a sneeze, and I didn't think I should sneeze on camera. Next stitch is a knit. We're going to knit that, I mean. Pick this up and over, like so. Next stitch is a purl, so we're going to bring the yarn to the front to purl. I'm going to purl that. Move the stitch back out of the way, or the yarn out of the way. Bind off, pick that up, and over. Last stitch is a purl, so we are going to take and purl that stitch up, or purl, move the yarn out of our way for our final bind off, and pick this up and over. Okay. Now we're going to cut our yarn and pull it through our loop. Okay, so what that has done is, and this is used a lot in ribbing, is see these columns of knit stitches and these column of purl stitches? If we had bound off regular, there would be a cap across these purl stitches and it would look funny. It would be a row of garter at the very top, and you don't want that. So what this has done is it's bound off in pattern so that row of purls go all the way up to the very tip top. Now, of course, there's that very top line because that's the bind off, and that's just the way that works. But it is less noticeable than if we had bound off regular because there would be a gap across that. If I had forethought, I would have knit a swatch and bound off without binding off in pattern, and you would see that. But I did not, so this is what we're stuck with. So this is bound off in pattern. You use this for ribbing, seed stitch, anytime that you want to see the pattern all the way up to the very end. And again, the ribbing goes all the way to the very end. So this is binding off in pattern. This is Stretchy Bind-Off. I'll put these like this again. And this is regular bind-off. Again, this doesn't have a whole lot of stretch to it. There is some, but not a lot, especially not compared to the long tail cast on. Okay? Then you have the Stretchy Bind-Off, which has a good bit of stretch to it and is very close to the long tail cast on. They have about the same stretch. So that's why I use the long tail cast on and the Stretchy Bind-Off together, because it has the same stretch. And then there's binding off in pattern, which gives the long tail cast on stretch, and that adds this to let this have more stretch than if you'd worked a regular bind off. So those are our 3 bind off methods. And hopefully now you can add these to your knitting repertoire and move forward, and now you have some options on binding off. In this next section, we're going to be looking at finished objects. I've got the warding spell shawl completed, and I've got it like this so you can't see any particular details on it until I show it. And I have pictures. I did a photo shoot with it yesterday. I also will be talking about the Prairie Jane Hat. This is, obviously folded up into quarters. And then I also completed the first of the Thanksgiving projects, and I decided on the Santa Gnomes to add a bell, so I'll be talking about this in the update section. So let's jump over and take a look at these a little bit more intimately. Okay, first up in the project updates is actually going to be this Prairie Jane Hat. This one is the first of the surprise Christmas knitting gifts. I used a fingering weight yarn held double, and then I worked from the crown down, and then did some 2x2 ribbing for the brim, and then a Stretchy Bind-Off to end off. I wanted to be able to see it, so that is I'm not going to do this one in the overhead. In fact, probably the only one that I will do in the overhead is going to be the warding spell shawl. But I got this completed, and I still have a good bit of that yarn left over. It is for my grandmother, and she has a very small head. So it looks like it's child-sized, and it very well could be. But that is the Prairie Jane Hat. Next up, I want to talk about the Santa gnome. This one is named Bertha because that is the aunt that it is going to. I will put a picture up of the recipients of these Santa gnomes here. What's special about these is one of my aunts had a bag of stuffing, or fluff, or fill, whatever you want to call it, that my great-grandmother had. And I had enough that each Santa gnome can have 14 grams of the stuffing. And I put it in the body so it's close to the heart, or where the heart would be on the gnomes. And so each of the sisters are going to have a Santa gnome that they can put out for Christmas. So it's just my usual gnome pattern. I did do the different color band for the Santa hat. You know, same color nose, same color beard as always. But then I added a stripe of black to make it look like a belt, and then added a bell to the top. I added the bell after the fact, and on the next ones I will be adding the bell before I stuff the gnome, so that way I can tie it inside with yarn. But this was my first attempt at trying this, so I did not know to do that yet. But what I used, and you may be able to see it, if I can get back and hide, there we go, is I used gold thread to tie it on there with, and secured it very well. So it's not coming off of there. It's jingly jangly, but it's not coming off. So that is Bertha. Last in the project updates, and probably most excited to talk about, is the warding spell shawl. Again, I'm showing it in this blob until I get done talking about it, because I don't want to give anything away yet, and I want the suspense to build as much as possible. This is, after all, a mystery knit project, and I want it to just let it build because I am maniacal. So first off, I want to talk about the stats. And I've got all that written down, so I'm going to be looking down and reading off. I had bought a skein of 150 grams, and I actually got 167 grams. And I used, it's a fingering weight, and I used a 6.5 millimeter or a US 10.5. And I marked on here, none of this will give it away, but I marked on here, I started weighing how much I had left after each of the repeats, just for my own sake of keeping arbitrary records. But I ended up using 146 grams. So if you got 150 gram skein of yarn and you knit to my exact same gauge, you will be able to knit this exactly like I knit it. Not even thinking, I have not checked the actual gauge to this yet, but I will put that information down at the bottom of the screen. Actually, I'll make a page, like a title page at the end, before I show the pictures of the photo shoot. I'll put all of that information right there. There are, well, I'll just get to show it. It is a very, very large shawl. It is not the shape that I had anticipated when I was thinking about the shawl. But that is okay, because it turned out amazing and I absolutely love it. So from tip to tip in a straight, I'm sorry, it's a big piece. It's all jumbled together. To tip to tip in a straight line is 72 inches or 6 feet, and I'll put the conversions down at the bottom. I'll do all of that on that title page. If you followed the actual swoop and shape of the shawl, it is 76 inches. From the widest or deepest point is 23 inches, and the flat edge, which you'll see here in just a second, is 49 inches. Again, all measurements and all conversions will be on the title page before you see the pictures. So I'm going to back up and see if I can even show most of it in the same deal. But this is the what I'm calling the flat edge here that you're seeing now, and that is actually the bind-off edge. There was 142 stitches on the bind-off, and it starts right up here with just 3 stitches, and it has these little sawtooth. Now some of this is blocked, some of it is not. I did steam block just with the iron and just pinned out, but it didn't block exactly like I'm wanting, so I'm actually going to try and wet block it. But for the sake of the video, this is plenty to see. Okay, so now then, before I switch to the other overhead, I want to talk a little bit about some of this here. Each of the teeth, and again, you'll be able to see this better in the overhead. Each of these teeth have a specific number of yarn overs in them, a total of 55, but that's really not relevant to the story, so you can forget I said that. But there's 10 yarn overs, or 10 rows in the repeat, and there are 12 points, 12 little teeth. Now the significance of that, you may recall that I said I knit this in honor of a friend of mine and our friendship, and he is very big into Dungeons & Dragons. In Dungeons & Dragons, and I am by no means an expert, this is all secondhand information, there are 10 levels of spells from 0 to 9, but being the way I am, I just count that 1 to 10, because that's the way my brain would work. And so there are 10 rows in each of the repeats to represent the 10 levels of spells. That goes this way, to the 10 levels of spells. And then there are 12 points, and that is in honor. There are 12 different class options that you can play, like wizard or cleric or druid or paladin or rogue or any number of things. There's 12 different classes, so there are 12 teeth. So that was my primary part. Secondary was I wanted it to look like something that Morticia Addams or Lily Munster might wear, because I love both of those. I don't like spooky, or I'm sorry, I don't like scary. I love spooky, like the Addams Family, the Munsters, and it's not scary, it's just kooky and unique and weird and an essence of scary without being scary. Scary for children. And I wanted something that was Halloween colors without being so overtly Halloween that you couldn't wear it other times of year. I feel like this one you could wear potentially year-round, you know, weather permitting. So that is kind of the bare bones of what this shawl is and what it became and how it come about. I have swatched this shawl twice, I think, before I actually started knitting. Yes, once to sample to see if I liked the way that the pattern was going to work, and I knit a swatch, and I'll throw that picture up at the end with all of the other pictures. And then I swatched when I was actually knitting this to see what size needles that I wanted. Again, I didn't care about the actual gauge of the stitches. I was going for drape. This shawl can be worn as a regular shawl, you know, kind of draped over here like so, or it can be worn like I wore it. I wore this yesterday. It was kind of chilly out. We're in autumn here in the northern hemisphere, and so it's starting to get cold, and it kind of has, like, the morning is very cold and the evenings are very warm, and sometimes it's vice versa, and the weather's just all over the place. And we joke that here in Arkansas you can have all 4 seasons in a single day, and that was pretty much true yesterday. So what I did yesterday is I actually wore it as a cowl underneath or cowl style underneath my jacket, and I wore it like this. And then underneath my jacket, you know, there was only this much showing, so nobody could tell that there was, no one could tell what it was. It just looked like I just had a scarf on, or even a cravat, which is specifically made to look like that. If you watch older shows and you see the guy in the dressing gown, the bathrobe, and the thing of scarf that kind of pooches out of it, and maybe sometimes a pin, that is a cravat. And it's just made to just keep right there warm where your coat may not cover. So I wore it as that, and it's amazingly soft. It's wool and silk. I don't remember the blend offhand, but I have my tablet right here, so I can look it up. It is 80% merino, 20% silk, 600 yards in 150 grams, and again I got 167 grams, which meant I had, let's see here, I don't show it here, but what I do have is I used 584 yards in this shawl. You could use any size yarn, just use needles to get the drape that you want, and you can just knit. You don't have to knit all 12 points. If you just wanted to do 10, that would be perfectly fine, but it's not knit that you have to do a certain number of repeats. If you wanted to stop at, say, 5 repeats and just make it like a handkerchief, you could certainly do that. It's just knit to your heart's desire. In my case, I wanted to knit at least 12, because again, there are 12 classes. Some sources in Dungeons & Dragons show 13 classes, but that's a bit of a potentially controversial thing. So I just wanted to see how far I could go. And it really, I mean, by 8 repeats, I had only used 14 grams of yarn after, let's see here, is that right? No. After 7 repeats, I had used 59 grams. The total for the 8th repeat was 14 grams. And the bind-off, there at the end, I was measuring every single section that I did. I measured 1 row, and 1 row was 1 gram, and bind-off used 2, because I used the stretchy bind-off, so it actually ends up knitting each stitch twice. So that's enough in the overview. We will now switch to the overhead and take a look at this more up close, and so you can actually see what I'm talking about like some mad lunatic. So we'll switch over now. As I mentioned in the overview, in this overhead, we're going to take a look at the features of this shawl. It's very big. I'm going to use these first few repeats because they're the easiest to see. Let me zoom this out a bit, and I'm actually going to stand up so I can see this a little better. So this is what we have here. Okay, work with me. There we go. Okay, so what you can see is these points here. So you work 10 rows in the repeat, and as you're working, so the first row you do 1 yarn over, second 2, third, so on and so forth. So you have 10 yarn overs going this way, and 10 yarn overs going this way, and that makes this almost like a tooth this way. What you end up with is, because you're knitting plain, is you're getting a triangle coming this way, so it looks like 2 sets of teeth coming through. So like there's our next tooth of yarn over and our tooth of the regular stitch. So all of your increases, these yarn overs are not increases. They look like it, but they are not. All of your increases are worked along this edge right here, okay? And then you do a slip the last stitch with yarn in front purlwise. So each one of these, 10 up this way, is for each of the level of the spells in Dungeons and Dragons. 10, and then there just so happens that there's 10 this way. This is not showing up very well, partially because it's supposed to set like this. So the 10 up this way and 10 over this way. Not 10 up and 10 over, okay? It's 10 over that way. Again, this needs a very large place to block it correctly, and I don't have that right now, so I just steam blocked to get me close. But make sure if you knit this, you find a spot where you can lay this out and block it correctly. You do want to take your points and whatever is directly across from that, and you want to pull that down when you block it. And the reason for is you want this to be very prominent. If you do not, I can show you up here. This is what happens. It just becomes kind of wavy, and you don't get the very prominent points which show off these triangle teeth, and that's what you're wanting in this. Now, if you knit this shawl and you don't want those blatantly obvious, you can just leave it and let it be curvy like that. That's totally okay if that's what you're wanting. It's not designed to be that way, but you can knit it that way. So that's what it's supposed to look like. It's supposed to be very sharp, like a bat's wing, if you want to think about it that way, which was part of the deal. Again, like something Lily Munster or Morticia Adams would wear. So think about that when you're knitting. What I like about this is this yarn. Let me see. Here's this yarn. This is all that I have left of it. It is predominantly black. Black can be notorious because it's hard to read your knitting. It does have a beautiful shine. That's the 20% silk in there. And it's very squishy. I love this yarn. That said, this is mostly black. There's just enough color in this to make this very easy to see, but it's not so colored, so brightly colored, that it gets lost here in this mesh. Okay? This is not lace. This is mesh. And there is a difference, and I'll go over that on a future video. But these little blips of color give it just enough that it's not super dark. I told someone, I said, it reminds me of like a 90s bowling alley carpet or roller rink carpet. That's what that kind of reminds me of, which is very nostalgic because I am a child of the 90s, and so I enjoy all things 90. Now, in the picture you're about to see, I thought I had accidentally cut the shawl. But what happened is there was a big splotch of this light color. I believe it was right here. Yeah, right here. And up against where the background that I did the photo shoot, it looked like I had cut a hole. But it just the way that pulling had done out. The body is knit in garter. And you may not like knitting garter because it's very boring. This one did not feel boring because for each of the 10 rows, you're doing something slightly different, but easy to memorize. So this is a lot of fun to knit. I definitely recommend it. I am not doing it justice with my words today, but maybe I can talk about it a little bit more in the future. Maybe on a video where I talk about what I do to get the design elements put into my patterns. But it's a lot of fun, and if you guys want, we can work on one of these together over the video, do what's called a knit along. See the end of the video for more information on that, and we can work this, and I can show you how I worked it and some tips and tricks that I did to make this a lot easier instead of having to count every stitch, every single row. But this is the Warding Spell Shawl. I absolutely love this. It was a lot of fun to knit. I knit it very quickly, given how big this thing is. I started on October 1st with my swatch. The swatch knit up quickly because I was just knitting, I think I knit 2 repeats on it. And then I was like, yes, this is what I want to do. And I don't even think I had to frog. And more on that at the end of the video. I think I had it on the needles that I decided I want to go with, and I could just keep going. So I started on October 1st, and finished it on the 22nd. I really was not sure when I started this if I would have this done by the end of October. But I did. This is a boomerang shawl, and you cannot see it on here. You can see it when I do see the pictures. It is or a crescent boomerang shawl. It comes up, down, and swoops up. So the shape of the shawl itself looks very much like these teeth. Okay, it swoops up, and instead of coming straight over, it has a swoop down. Again, you'll see that on the pictures. But this is the Warning Spell shawl. I'm super happy with it and love knitting it and loved the mystery of showing you guys on my channel. In the final segment for this week, we're going to be talking about some potentially confusing knitting lingo. These are all usually acronyms, but there are a couple of other words. So let's go ahead and jump over. I will show the words down here at the bottom of the screen, and then we will talk about it as we go through. So let's get talking about confusing knitting lingo. So again, knitting slang. It can be very confusing. There's a lot of unusual, some are acronyms, some are actually words. So let's take a look. I've got them all written out down here so that way I can give you the most accurate information that I possibly can. Potentially in the most concise way. We'll see how much I jumble over my words, but that's just part of everyday life and being a human being. Sometimes not everything is so neat and tidy, and that is okay. So our first vocab word, if you will, is whip, and I'll put that down here at the bottom. What whip is it stands for work in progress. An example of a whip would be this swatch that I'm doing for a project that my mom wants me to knit for her. So here's the swatch. And it uses these honeycomb cables, and I did this down here to make sure I got the correct gauge with this yarn and this needle to knit this particular pattern. This is the gauge swatch for that, but because I have not bound off and I am actively knitting on this, that is the key word, actively knitting. This makes this a work in progress. You can set it down for a couple of days, but if it's down for a month, 2 months, 3 years, it becomes our next vocab word. Our next vocab word is UFO, which stands for unfinished project. Again, whip and UFO, some people use those interchangeably. I only call something a UFO if I have put it in what Ravelry calls hibernation. It sits in there for at least a month, possibly 12 years for some people. But that is a project that you have on the needles or on a stitch marker or a stitch holder, but you are not actively working on it. It is resting and you're taking a break from it. That makes it a UFO. This again being a whip. Our next bit of lingo is DPN, which I've talked about here before, and that stands for double pointed needle. And here's an example right here. Very easy to see why it's called a double pointed needle. It's pointed on both ends, so it's double pointed needle. You can knit this one from either direction. This one is usually used for knitting in the round for small circumferences, like say socks or fingers on a mitten. You can also use it, like I have with this. I use this as my cable needle, and more on all of that in a future video. But you can use a double pointed needle as a cable needle. You can also use the double pointed needle to swatch. I believe I have done Swatch Labs with double pointed needles because they're usually smaller than a regular needle. You can get them as small as like a 4 or 5 inch, like if you're doing the fingers of a glove. And then the longest ones I found have been 8 inches that I personally have found, but I do know that you can get 14-inch double-pointed needles, and that is for a very specific knitting technique, which I may talk about in a future video. It's not one that I use, so I don't know much about it. But that is your double-pointed needle, or your DPN. Very versatile tool to have. Our next vocab word, and I know I'm just info dumping and a lot in rapid succession, but pause and you can back up or refer to this in future videos. But our next vocab is KAL down here, and that stands for knit along. And what a knit along is it can be formatted in a few different ways. One of the ways that you can do it is you can have like a knit night, or even from a YouTube video. And what you do is you announce, we are going to be knitting this project over this point, and you are welcome to knit along with me, and we knit it together. Not everyone has to knit it at the exact same speed. The point is that you are knitting a project from this point to this point. You're knitting along together. If it's on video, you can do a knit along 3 years after the fact, but you watch the videos while you're knitting, and the videos usually are broken up into segments. Like, for example, again on this swatch, the cables are the same on both sides, but for a knit along, say one video you knit all this stockinette part together. That was the end of that video. That was the end of that segment. The next video you come together and you knit this much, or a segment, or you are taught how to knit the cable pattern, and they may say knit it for this amount of repeats or for this amount of inches, and that is your next one. Another knit along may be like what we do in the Swatch Lab, where I tell you to go ahead and knit up a swatch and use this pattern, and then on another video you come back and we do the bind-off together. So you can kind of make your own little knit along. Now usually the knit alongs that I have seen have been via YouTube, via whether that be Zoom or YouTube, but it's through a screen. You can do a knit along in person, again like a knit night, where you all come together and you decide that you're going to knit this hat pattern. I have heard of knit alongs where we are going to be knitting socks. People can choose their own sock pattern, but they knit socks together, and that one is usually more of a group of people in person knitting. Not always, but sometimes. So that is what KAL, or knit along, means. Our next vocab word is KIP. I have personally done KIP multiple times. KIP stands for knitting in public, or for you it'd be this way, knitting in public, and I do that every time I go to the doctor's office. I take a project with me. This last doctor's office, I actually took the beard to be able to knit for this gnome. A lot of times I take socks, but it could be anything, and it's not just a doctor's office. You can go on your lunch break to the park and you eat your sandwich or whatever it is, and then you knit on a shawl, or you knit the sleeve of a sweater, or it doesn't matter what you're knitting. The point is that you're knitting in a public place. Sometimes there are groups and it says, meet us in the park at this time for a group knit in public. There's no other reason necessarily for them to group and get together other than they just want to knit in public. There is an actual knit in public day, so you can look up and see if anyone in your area is partaking in that and has any particular get-togethers or places to meet up or anything of that sort. But that is KIP, knit in public. Our second to last vocab is frog, or frogging. Usually just said frog, but the act of doing a frog is frogging. And what that means is you have done a swatch and you're done with the swatch. You're not going to bind off. You've gotten all of the information out of it that you want. You don't need the swatch, or you need the yarn from the swatch. What you do, I'm not going to do it on this one because I'm not done working on this swatch, but what you do is you take your needle and completely pull it out, and, you know, get rid of any stitch markers, and you unravel it. You just pull the yarn and just unravel. And what you're doing is you are ripping out stitches. You are rip, rip, rip it, rip it, rip it. Sounds like ribbit, which is what we say in English, is what a frog says. So you are frogging. It is to frog. Rip it, rip it. It is not done something that is violent. You're not tearing it. You're just ripping out stitches. That is what you would do usually for a large section, is you would frog it. If you're only going back a couple of rows or even just a couple of stitches, you do this last vocab word, which is tink. T-I-N-K, which if you spin that word around, it is K-N-I-T, or knit. So as that sounds, you are unknitting stitch by stitch, or tinking. I actually did some tinking in a past video in a Swatch Lab when I showed you 2x2 ribbing, and I said, okay, you're knitting along and you accidentally did 2 stitches incorrectly, and I showed you very, very briefly. It'll be covered more fully in another video, but I showed you tinking. You are unknitting or unworking. Tinking is used whether it's knitting that you're undoing or purling. It's just the name that's used for that. So those are our vocab words: whip, W-I-P, UFO, DPN, KAL, KIP, frog or frogging, and tink or tinking. So those are our 7 words and some secret code language of knitters. So maybe you can use some of these moving forwards and make your knitting just that much more special by using terminology that only other knitters will know. So enjoy those words. To wrap up this week's video, we did 3 different bind-offs in the Swatch Lab. We looked at 3 separate finished objects, including the long-anticipated warding spell shawl. And in the final section, we talked about bizarre or unusual and very unique knitting vocab words. That is usually it for this video, but I did want to make an announcement. As you know, last week I did not release a video on Saturday, and I've decided that on weeks that I did a 0.5 episode or a bit episode, I will not also release a full knit video. You know, life happens and stuff gets in the way, so if I can release one video of the 2, it's easier to release the bit video. There are obviously exceptions to the rule. Sometimes I won't release any videos that week if something crazy has happened, like life. And sometimes I will release both videos a week. But as a general rule of thumb, there will be one or the other one released. Also, a viewer pointed out that if I just give the definition or the knitting word of the day that I do in the 0.5 episodes, but I don't show an example, then it's a little bit trickier for it to sink in. So, this last week's word of the day, our very first one, is twit, which means a small section or a thinner section in yarn, usually from hand spun. You can buy, it's called thick and thin yarns, but usually hand spun, and I have an example of that right back here. And again, twit is where they take the yarn and it's wound a little bit thinner than regular. So here is a good example of that. So right here we have that size segment. But down here, the exact same yarn is only that size. See how this bottom one is smaller than the top? It's not super noticeable, but it is noticeable. That bottom, let's see here, here's a much better size. Right here. This little section right here. See how it's noticeably thinner? That right there is a twit. I don't know who decided that it was going to be named a twit, but someone in their wisdom decided that it was going to be named twit. Also in thick and thin yarns, you can have a super thick and a super thin, and that makes it hard to gauge what size yarn this is. Do you go off of the thick side? Do you go off the thin side? You can't know from looking at this which one is, if it's predominantly thicker or predominantly thinner. So you can't just choose an average. So thick and thin yarns can be tricky to place on the already confusing knitting yarn weight continuums. But I just wanted to show in person what a twit was to hopefully help that definition sink in. And now you can see it more readily in the wild. So that wraps up this week's video. I hope you enjoyed yourself. I hope you learned something. And I hope I may have inspired you to reach out and get the pattern for the Warding Spell shawl. I absolutely love this, and I would absolutely love for you to knit this up and send me pictures. I would love to post them up on the video, but I also want to know if the pattern works out for you, if it made sense, if it was easy to follow, and if you had any difficulties with this and all of that, especially if you knit this in a different weight. Again, this is fingering in a 6.5 millimeter. I love getting pictures of people. I do have someone that watches that has been swatching, and they send me pictures periodically of their swatch, and I absolutely love it. I love to see knitters knitting. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. I hope you may send me pictures moving forward. And until next video, keep knitting.